Today, we're going to compare the cameras on a Galaxy S23 Plus versus the Sony Xperia 1.5. And it looks like with the front camera's HDR is not as good as the Samsung. You can clearly tell from the back here. You can see the trees, you can see the sky, but it's all blown out on the Sony. As I'm looking through these pictures, I noticed the ultra-wide and wide on the Sony sometimes is brighter than a Galaxy and sometimes it's darker than a Galaxy. So it's always not the same. Sometimes the Xperia looks better, sometimes the Galaxy looks better. So it's always a back and forth between the ultra-wide / wide. So the levels of exposure is not always the same, but one thing I do know is that the Sony have trouble exposing for the highlights. Now it's not all the time, but it is more often than a Galaxy. For the colors, that's of course personal preference, but I do like how the Sony renders out their pictures more closer to a camera. So as a photographer or videographer, you would probably like the images out of the Sony much more than a Galaxy. But for regular consumers, I would say they would lean towards the Galaxy just because everything is more exposed, things are brighter, and they just want to see more. So the images coming out of the Galaxy is a pretty typical cell phone picture where it is kind of like over processed, and people or photographers may not want that. As I'm zooming in using the telephoto lens, I do notice that the Sony does produce a bit more noise in the shadows, especially when you're in darker situations. It's not really noticeable until you're all the way up to 15x, which is pretty much max zoom on a Sony, whereas on a Galaxy you can zoom all the way up to 30x. And I would say that's pretty helpful in terms of just seeing things from afar and not to really take good pictures with. I do want to mention about the camera experience between the two. The Galaxy is definitely more user-friendly, it's easier to use, and people would just pick it up and learn how to use it quicker. On a Sony, it is a bit more busier, there's a lot more icons, which they may not know what it means, but if you do have a Sony camera or if you pretty much have any camera knowledge, then the learning curve is going to be much more quicker. But like anything new, it will take some time to learn, and once you do, it would be easy to use after. And even though Sony has their own basic mode, which is pretty close to the cell phone experience where you take it out, take a quick picture, and move on with your life, it's still not as seamless as the Galaxy. Like the little things where if I hit the shutter button, there's no vibration or no animation to tell me that it took a picture. And when I'm taking pictures vertically, my palm or fingers sometimes just hit the shutter button where it's kind of like half stuck to focus, but I cannot press the shutter button on the screen to take the picture. So it does get pretty annoying taking picture in that vertical orientation. As we move into darker situations like in a bar or during nighttime, the Sony does feel a bit more sluggish when I'm taking pictures. I feel like things have to be still to be clear, but if they are moving, like taking pictures of friends talking, it's gonna be blurry. And this is all shot in the basic mode where I'm coming from an average consumer, so kind of like just the casual use of a regular phone. And for the telephoto, as we move on into darker areas, I do notice that the 3x, starting from the 3x now, the Galaxy seems to be a lot cleaner. Unlike during the daytime where you can see the noise at 15x on a Sony, it's kind of like shifted down to the 3x. Now moving up to the 5x range, I do notice that there are times where the pictures will come out blurry on a Sony. I feel like the stabilization sometimes doesn't activate and it ends up being a blurrier image, but on a Galaxy, it's pretty consistent throughout the whole entire zooming experience. So as I'm moving into darker areas like at a bar or a dinner spot, I feel like I may want to avoid anything after 3.5x. For low light video in ultra wide, I would avoid using the Sony just because it doesn't look that great, it's blurry, the highlights are not exposed correctly, and it just makes the Galaxy looks a lot better. Now moving on to the wide lens, it is a lot better, but still not as clean. As you can tell, the sky is a lot more noisy on the Sony. Like I said before, with the exposure on the Sony, the highlights are pretty much clipped on a lot of areas, especially when you're indoors with bright lights or like having sun from the window. But if you're outside at a park or something where there's a lot of light, then I feel like Sony would do just fine. Now for the ultra wide, if you haven't noticed yet, the Galaxy is a lot wider, so definitely more helpful in tight situations. But when you're in between buildings with a bright sun in the background, definitely the Galaxy has that like overexposed or typical cell phone look where, you know, the whole HDR look. But on a Sony, it's definitely blown out where the sky is white and not blue anymore. With the Sony Xperia phone, you do get other apps where it's more focused on video, on cinema, and photography. And like I said before, using this phone feels pretty similar if you already have a Sony camera. So with that being said, it's obvious Sony is trying to push this towards the filmmakers, the photographers, not really the casual consumer. And I'm grateful that they have this basic mode just to give you that close to a typical cell phone experience. But regarding to the other video apps where you do get a lot more features or more video/cinema focused, I feel like for a casual consumer, they would probably never touch these apps at all. But if you're someone who shoots with a Sony camera who does this as a job or make money from it, then this phone may be like the ultimate portable backup for your B-roll or pickup shots to add to your big project that was shot with Sony cameras. And before moving on to portrait mode pictures, I want to show you how annoying it is getting into the portrait mode. First, you have to press on a person with like a tree in the background, and then you would have to press on the bokeh button, which maybe a lot of regular consumers don't know what that means. Then you would have to tap on the screen so you can see the 1x, 3.5x, and 5.2x. And when you take a look at the picture that you just took and go out of it, you're back at the home camera page. So if you still want to take portrait mode pictures, you would have to go through that 3 steps to get back to that same mode. So it is pretty annoying. The UI is kind of clunky or is very structured. Now going in between these focal lengths, it's nice to be able to shoot from 3.5 to 5.2x, but when you're shooting at the 5.2x, you would definitely need a lot more space. So it's not really ideal to use it when you're indoors. So personally, I do wish that there was a 2x option because from 1x to 3.2x can be a pretty big jump. I do like the colors coming out of the Sony because the skin tone really looks neutral, whereas on a Galaxy, you can tell that it's a bit more saturated. As this is my second time using this Sony Xperia phone, I feel like shooting with the wide camera is the best thing to do, and I do feel a little bit iffy going into the ultrawide or even the telephoto lenses. But as a whole, I really like how these pictures does feel like it's coming out of a camera from the Sony and less of the over-processed look. I feel like this phone will be a lot better once they get the highlighted situation in control, but that is my comparison between these two phones. I did compare the Sony phone against the iPhone 14 Pro, so I'll put that up right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.